Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with baked feta phyllo with honey. That's right, my favorite flavor combination of all time is sweet and salty. And while there are thousands of different ways to combine those two elements, there are none more delicious or beautiful or perfect than baked feta with honey. Oh, and since we're using ready-made phyllo dough, this is also very fast and easy. And to get started, the first thing we'll need is some high-quality feta, which typically come in these 7-ounce blocks that are about an inch thick, which unfortunately for this preparation is going to be too thick. So what we'll need to do is split this in half so we can get 2 portions. But the problem is if we try to cut through the whole thing, it's going to be tricky to get an accurate cut, and the feta could break. So to make this easier, let's go ahead and cut it in half, and then we'll tip this smaller piece on its side, and we will carefully cut right down through the middle with our knife. In this way, we have less cheese to go through as we slice this into the proper thickness. And that's it once cut. If we place both of those pieces together, as you'll see when we wrap this, we're going to have the perfect size and shape for the amount of phyllo we're going to use. And by the way, I'm using a Greek feta, which is made with sheep and goat milk, which in my opinion produces the best feta. But any feta that's moist enough to cut through and doesn't crumble will work for this. And if you're worried that second one I just cut is not going to work because it's so uneven, don't worry, it'll be fine. Okay, I'm just going to turn this side to make it match a little better. And really, once our cheese is wrapped, that variation in thickness will not matter at all. And that's it. Once we've cut the cheese, we will move on to mixing up our egg, butter, olive oil mixture, which, believe it or not, we will make by adding some melted butter and some olive oil to an egg, and then whisking it until we have a nice emulsion. And this is what we'll use to brush on our phyllo before we wrap our feta. And speaking of phyllo dough, once we're ready to assemble, we will place 2 sheets down on our counter. And by the way, ignore those cracks and terrible appearance for the moment. I'm going to talk about that very shortly. But what we'll do once we have 2 sheets down is start brushing this carefully with our egg mixture. And we don't need to or even want to go for total coverage. Okay, I'd say about 75% of the surface is ideal. And now that we've covered that, let's talk cracks. Okay, if you use store-bought phyllo, there's almost always going to be some cracks, especially if you try to unroll it while it's still partially frozen, which I always do. But as you're about to see, those are really not going to cause a problem. And once our phyllo is brushed, we will place our feta down, leaving enough dough at the bottom so that we can fold that up over the cheese and it covers completely. And then we'll go ahead and brush that part. And once that's been accomplished, we will fold over both sides towards the center, right nice and neatly up to the edges of our cheese. Oh, and as I do this, please note the positioning of those cracks, which are sort of near the middle, a little bit towards the top. Just keep that in mind for a moment while I give this one more brushing with our egg mixture. And the reason I want you paying attention to where those cracks are is because once this is brushed, to finish it, we're simply going to roll it up into a nice tight package, hopefully ending up with our seams on the bottom. And because those cracks were in the spots they were, as I finished the fold, those ended up being on top, which again, as you'll see, is not going to be a problem. But let me go ahead and fold up this second one and show you a little bit of a workaround. Okay, so I started with 2 sheets again, and I brushed it exactly the same way, except please note, I turned those phyllo sheets around so the cracks were near the bottom, closer to where I'm going to be placing the cheese. And by starting with any cracked dough in that area, by the time this gets folded and rolled up, those cracks are going to be folded inside, and if everything goes according to plan, we should end up with a perfectly smooth surface. And yes, it would have been nice if both of the ones I made had a perfectly smooth surface, but it took me making that first one and seeing where those cracks started and where they ended up to be able to improve the method and end up with the best appearance possible. All right, in the business, we refer to this as the learning process. But visible cracks or not, once these are done, we'll transfer them onto a Silpat lime baking sheet. And there's the nice one, followed by what we'll call the worst case scenario one. And then before these go in a nice hot oven, we will brush those tops with our egg mixture, followed by, if we want, an optional application of sesame seeds. And I'm going to do both white sesame seeds and a few black sesame seeds, which I just think makes these look so much more interesting. And who among us does not enjoy food that looks interesting? Oh, and while I sprinkle those, let me sneak in a shameless plug for a video we posted recently called Black Magic Sesame Crisps, which is one of the most delicious and addictive cracker-like snacks you will ever eat. So if you haven't seen it and you have black sesame seeds, please check it out. And that's it. Once those have been seeded, or not, they are ready to transfer into the center of a 425-degree oven for about 20 minutes, or until they're beautifully browned and look like this. And you might be thinking, you may just listen to all that crack talk for nothing, since both of those look fine. Well, you know what? You're probably right. And as long as these are nice and crisp and browned, including the bottoms, then we did a fine job. Although that second one we did on the right does look better. And now I'm going to let it go. And we will transfer these onto a cutting board. And I will prove I'm over the crack issue by cutting and serving the less perfect one first. And for that, I'm going to use a mezzaluna, which is perfect for cutting things in half. I mean, the word half is right in the name. And hopefully you can see here what I think is the perfect ratio between that gorgeous hot creamy feta and that crispy flaky phyllo dough. So to me, that is looking just about perfect. But hold on, it gets better. So let's go ahead and plate these up and move on to the real money shot, which is of course this being slowly drizzled with lots of Greek honey, or of course the honey of your choice. I mean, you are after all the Bad Bunny, of which honey? Right, typically I would use a local honey, but because I'd used Greek feta and had recently bought some Greek honey online after watching a show about blue zones, which are areas where people live to like 110, I decided to go with that. But no matter what you use plenty. And once that was generously drizzled, I went ahead and grabbed a fork, and we will take a bite of what I think is sweet and salty perfection. And of course, there is so much more going on with a good feta than just saltiness. Okay, it's also savory and creamy and a little bit funky. And all those things, along with the saltiness, are why this is an absolute perfect pairing with the honey. And I should have mentioned it earlier, but what makes this baked feta phyllo different from most versions is that they generally just use butter or olive oil or a combination to brush the phyllo with. Whereas here we also use some egg, which adds some moisture and richness and makes this a little more pastry-like than your typical baked phyllo recipe. All right, those often look nice and they're very crispy, but as soon as you put the fork in, it basically explodes into like 1,000 different dry, flaky pieces. So I do prefer the texture of this approach. Plus, since we're using a little less butter and oil, this version is in fact a little lower in calories. Although of all the reasons to make this, that is by far the worst one. And the other thing I love about this is how versatile it is as far as when you can serve it. Right, we can make a batch of these and then cut them up in pieces, and they make a fantastic appetizer for any party. Or you can serve this with hot coffee or tea for breakfast. And when you eat something like this in the morning, you are setting yourself up for a very successful day. Try it, you'll see. And then finally, you could put a big salad next to one of these and have it for lunch or dinner, or both. But no matter how or when you enjoy this, it is profoundly delicious and fast and easy to make, which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.